Well, Pfizer engaged in false, deceptive, and misleading acts and practices by making unsupported claims regarding the COVID-19 vaccine in violation of the Texas Deceptive Trade Practices Act. This is what Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton is claiming in his lawsuit against Pfizer that was launched at the end of November. Now, this is really interesting, and I think that it's Paxton swinging for the fences here in this lawsuit so that Pfizer is forced to show its hand and forced to show us what they knew and what they absolutely did not know. This is based on 6 months of investigation from the Attorney General's office. Now, it's interesting because he was kicked out of that office for a long time. We're going to talk about this because we didn't really talk much about the impeachment trial of Ken Paxton on this show, but it was really interesting, and I think we need to know who it is that's leading this charge against Pfizer. In an interview with Tucker Carlson recently after his acquittal, he talked about what he had been through, how he had been attacked, why he thinks it was because he has been so aggressive against the Biden administration policies. It really has taken a man with a mission and turned him into a man with a mission, if you know what I mean. He was called the most aggressive legal opponent of the Biden administration in the United States. In fact, here's CNN admitting that Texas is the place where Biden laws go to die because Ken Paxton is so litigious against Biden laws. In fact, he sued the administration over the border, over healthcare, over the environment, specifically around the Keystone Pipeline. He says that is most likely why he faced this impeachment watch.
Had filed 48 suits against the Biden administration.
Yes, and I think that was the motivation. We were causing a lot of trouble for the Biden administration. Even if we didn't win, we slowed them down, and we were winning. I think our number is 77% of our cases. So we are a huge problem for the Biden administration, and that was the way to get me out of the way. And obviously that had an impact on the lawsuits being filed by Texas and other states.
So you think that that the effort to remove you from office really came from the Biden administration?
I really do. I think that's where it was instigated, and then there were other groups in Texas that we can talk about that I think were largely participating.
All right. Well, when he faced impeachment, he was not allowed to even go into his office. He was not allowed to further his litigation or any of his work that he had been elected to do. Watch.
So what happens once it was announced you're being impeached? What happens to you?
It was horrible. I was immediately suspended, so I lost my office. I couldn't do any more lawsuits against Biden or anything.
What do you mean you were suspended?
Suspended means I can't be in the office anymore. I can't direct what's going on in the office, even though I'm elected, even though they proved nothing, even though they had no testimony, no evidence.
You hadn't been convicted?
Hadn't been convicted. They had presented no evidence. They had presented no witnesses, and I'm out.
How? Okay. That's a very weird process. So you don't even know you're being investigated. The moment you find out you're being investigated and impeached, you're suspended from your job?
Yes. It's the way that I think it's constitutional. And I think it needs to be changed because they should have to prove something before the will of the voters is overridden. And that's what happened. The will of the voters, I was in 4.5 months. Now I've been out of office, suspended for almost 4 months. So half my time of my term now, I've spent not being able to do what the people of Texas elected me to do.
Okay. Now, I do want to recommend that you watch this interview because he speaks about how attorney generals can no longer litigate election fraud. That's interesting, right? It's terrifying, but that's not what we're going to look at here, so I don't want to get off base. Let's look at Pfizer. We came here to look at this litigation. Let's do it. Here is his lawsuit. Here is his main claim that, in a nutshell, Pfizer deceived the public. First, by misrepresenting the efficacy of the Pfizer vaccine, and he's going to point out that they knew that 95% was a BS number. And then they continued to mislead the public even after they had their feet held to the fire. And then he says that not only that, it literally didn't work, and people who received this vaccine were more likely to have negative outcomes of COVID. This is true. The problem that I have with this, and we're going to talk about how Ken Paxton overcomes this, is that yes, Pfizer did give this BS research methodology to the FDA, but the FDA allowed it, and the FDA regularly allows this with clinical trials of medicines and vaccines. This is a problem that they're going to have to overcome because of this research. Now, I can give you many vaccines and medicines that have been manipulated in their clinical trials. And I have done that here on this show, but here's one that I think is just worth looking at. Recall this from the book Dope Sick, that FDA regulators and big pharma executives in 2002 were quietly holding private meetings at expensive hotels. This was found out by the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. The meetings led to the development of what they called enriched enrollment, an aptly named practice that allowed drug companies to weed out people from their studies who didn't respond well to the drugs, therefore tipping the balance towards FDA approval of new drugs and away from science. So this is one of many examples where the FDA knows that the books are being cooked on these vaccine trials and allows it. So yes, Pfizer used what Al Gore would call fuzzy math to do this, but the FDA still gave them emergency use authorization. Now, Texas is claiming that they gamed the FDA, but the FDA is not a party to this litigation. It kind of makes you wonder why, right? If the FDA was pushing Pfizer for better numbers and Pfizer was sort of hoodwinking them and then going around them and going to the press and saying totally bogus things, you would think maybe the FDA would want in on this litigation. I do think they would be forced to testify if this case goes forward. And so that's an interesting thing to look at. But they say then that they took this data and lied to the public, even so. Now, the AG claims that the FDA was warning Pfizer how they wanted better data and that they weren't all that happy and they wanted to be followed up with. This is news to me because the FDA never informed the... Go ahead, David. Yeah.
Well, I was saying, can I ask, is that why the FDA worked with them to try to hide this data for 75 years? Because that was both of them doing that together.
Right. When FOIA requests were put out towards the FDA was protecting Pfizer. That's an excellent point. What Ken Paxton says is that the FDA was pushing them, but they didn't tell us that. So that's interesting, right? Because we are owed informed consent. We are supposed to give informed consent. That means we must be informed. So if the FDA wasn't all that happy with the numbers it was getting from Pfizer, shouldn't they have told us rather than continuing to issue these authorizations for the COVID vaccine? Here's what he says about that. He says the FDA had warned Pfizer that it needed additional information to determine whether the vaccine protected against transmission of COVID. But instead, Pfizer engaged in a fear-mongering campaign. And then look at the third point here. It says Pfizer knowingly made false and unsupported claims about vaccine performance against variants, specifically about Delta, because they didn't know anything about Delta. They just went out there and said, oh yeah, it's probably good against Delta too. Now, he says that Pfizer tried to censor the former head of the FDA for pointing out that the vaccine was not effective against the Delta virus and went so far as to call people who were critical of the vaccine as criminals. We've seen that from Albert Bourla, the CEO of Pfizer. Here's where he sort of lets the FDA off the hook, though. This is Ken Paxton. I'm pretending he wrote this personally, but this is where the state of Texas says that Pfizer can't attempt to hide behind the FDA to shield its deception from scrutiny, especially where, as here, the FDA explicitly cautioned the company that it did not have adequate data to support various claims. Well, again, that's so interesting, right? Because the FDA appears to be holding Pfizer's feet to the fire, but they never told us, right? Anyone? Yeah, that's weird. Okay. In
that
short,
would have caused vaccine hesitancy.
Right.
They couldn't be doing that.
If the FDA had any kind of butterflies in its stomach, it owed us an explanation about it.
Right, because these people were on television and they were in front of Congress on a regular basis, testifying before Congress. And they were telling us and encouraging us to go out and get double boosted.
Who's these people you're talking about?
FDA, head of the FDA, and representatives from the FDA on television showing up on Bloomberg and on CNBC and others.
Right.
Who were telling us that everything's safe. Don't worry about anything.
Right.
Go out and get boosted. Go out and get triple boosted.
Yeah.
Go out and get quadruple boosted.
Right. So I do wonder why the FDA is painted here as like, well, they tried and Pfizer was hoodwinking them and telling us something else. Because, again, the FDA has to decide what side of the table they want to be in. Are they going to be with Pfizer or are they going to come around to the table with Ken Paxton in the state of Texas?
What do you think? Where do they get their money? Again, if they cared, they would have been out on television telling us what they knew privately,
Right.
what they were saying behind closed doors to Pfizer executives,
Yeah.
warning them and telling them, here's what we're seeing, what's going on here. And instead they put out this, they put
Right.
out smoke, basically.
And a lot
With their track records, with the pharmaceutical industry's track record, you would think the FDA, they're the ones that are supposed to scrutinize the information they give them. So it's like when they did the trials and everything, that you could only select a certain amount of things from the app. And if you didn't go by one of those, you were removed from the study. That's something the FDA would see. They would see the data that they're getting. So they're supposed to be on the pharmaceutical industry, keeping their feet to the fire on this information, but obviously they don't.
Right. The research methods are very suspect. For instance, they only counted if certain people who had taken the COVID vaccine got COVID within a 2-week period after the second vaccine, whereas a lot of them got COVID in between the first and second vaccine, and they didn't count that. They counted those as success rates because those people didn't get COVID in only the windows they were looking at. Again, they only were looking for whether or not those people got COVID, not symptomatic COVID, not severe COVID. Furthermore, a large number, something like 7,000 of the placebo group went ahead and got vaccinated. So it wasn't a true placebo group. Why did they allow that, right? That's kind of weird. All kinds of strange things. Now, a large part of this hinges on what Pfizer did when it became clear that their vaccine was not performing well and people were still getting COVID. What did they do? They doubled down. They continued to use their exceedingly flawed data from their very small and problematic studies. Here is a summary that's worth reading. They also accuse Pfizer CEO Albert Bourla of starting this misinformation campaign in the summer of 2020, even before there was a COVID vaccine. Here's what he said. He talked about how the vaccine works in humans, said that it creates immune responses that are able to kill the virus, and that the vaccine can neutralize the virus. But as the emergency use authorization data later showed, Pfizer measured efficacy only against symptomatic COVID, not whether the vaccine was neutralized or killing a virus. So he was saying things that they simply had not studied or did not know. He would have, and so we can match up the timeline. What did they actually study in this month versus what this guy, this talking head, said to us, the American public? What did they present to the FDA versus what they knew? This lawsuit is packed full of statements that either Pfizer released or Bourla himself said about what Pfizer knew, and a lot of them just don't add up. And he also, Texas Attorney General Paxton, says that many cases of COVID deaths and outbreaks happened amongst the vaccinated. We've covered this before. Now the CDC even admits that COVID vaccination is a risk factor for getting COVID. They've been admitting this since last summer, that if you've been vaccinated, you are more prone to get COVID and more severe COVID. Okay, this is just the first gauntlet thrown in a lawsuit. We know that that's, it doesn't all have to stick. You sort of make your best case and then see what the courts will allow you to fight on. That's a big if, because remember that Pfizer had impressive immunity from the government around the COVID vaccine. So how can they be sued? Fraud. Fraud is the one thing that pierces the corporate veil. So we'll see if they can actually prove it. Will it be a disservice to all of us if they settle this? Yeah, right? I want to see it fought. I want to see it litigated because I want to see the discovery. I want Pfizer to have to put up these documents publicly because they are ordered to by a judge. I want that. I need that. But that's
And
actually...
we also
go ahead.
hope that we get to actually read them without getting a copy or getting a strike on our channel.
Right.
Right.
You come out.
Yeah. You may recall that in the summer of 2021, was that it? Yeah, Redacted, we read Pfizer's own clinical trials and we were punished with a channel strike that made us go dark for 2 weeks. Now, what the Attorney General is seeking is just money. They want monetary relief in an amount greater than $1 million. Okay. I also would like to request an apology and also some kind of you can't do it this way ever again. I also would like the FDA to put in place real vaccine trials and actual federally mandated adverse events reporting. We don't have that. We absolutely should. So will we get any of that from this, or will Texas just get a monetary settlement because Pfizer doesn't want to fight this in court? If it were me, if I were Attorney General Paxton, I wouldn't settle for the moon. You got to try this. You got to take this and let us see what they knew and what they lied to us about. That's how I feel about it. Let me know how you feel about it in the chat.
Thank you so much for watching this segment here at Redacted. We are live every day at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, trying to share the stories that the mainstream media will not cover. You should also come over and join our community of Redacted Rebels over at redacted.inc. That's our private locals community where we can share exclusive content that we simply cannot share here on YouTube. Come over and join the rebellion together right now by going to redacted.inc. We'll see you next time.